Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Doug Brake with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I do the telecom policy work here. So many of you know, but we're a small nonpartisan research and education institution founded to formulate and promote public policies to advance innovation and productivity growth through information technology. So, as many of you know, in the run-up to the State of the Union address earlier this year, President Obama launched a broad federal effort to try to expand access to fast and affordable broadband. Part of this effort is what we're here to discuss today, the Interagency Broadband Opportunity Council. So this council pulls together a diverse group of federal agencies, 25 different federal agencies, led by ITIA, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Agriculture. The Broadband Opportunity Council is designed to identify unnecessary regulatory and policy barriers to spur investment and align funding policies and decisions to support broadband access and adoption. Now, our research here at ITIF shows that our broadband networks in the United States are actually doing pretty darn well. But that, of course, is no reason to rest on our laurels. And in that spirit, a spirit that there's always room for improvement, I think that the aims and goals of the Interagency Broadband Opportunity Council is something that we can all get behind. That being said, I think that there are a number of outstanding challenges and difficult questions that lie ahead for a council composed of 25 different federal agencies. So we pulled together this panel to try to address some of those challenges. Questions, all sorts of questions. How do we frame a uniform strategy that everyone can get behind? How can we get ideas? What are the ideas and policies that can spur development and adoption of next generation services? And how can we get agency buy-in? How do we get everyone, rowing in the same direction? So NTIA and Department of Agriculture, who are leading the effort, have put out a request for comment. And those comments are due fairly soon here, coming in, I believe, June 10th. So in advance of that, get a few ideas out there, get some discussion going before everyone gets to filing away. So we've got a great panel lined up here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our panelists already, but I'll run through very briefly their bios. We've got Blair Levin, who's now a senior fellow at Brookings in their Metropolitan Policy Program. We have Stacy Pies with Google. She is a senior public policy and government relations counsel at Google and is also a chair of the board of the Vaughn Coalition. We have Tom Power, who's got a deep background in these issues. He's now Senior Vice President and General Counsel at CTIA. He's formerly with OSTP in the White House, and before that was Chief of Staff at NTIA, so can kind of triangulate on these issues. So a brief note on format. We're doing the classic panel format where we'll hear from each of the panelists, a few brief introductory remarks, and then go into a moderated Q&A, and then have hopefully plenty of time for questions from the audience. So be thinking of those questions as we go along. Also, we've got, if you'd like to follow along on Twitter, we've got a hashtag broadband plan. So anyone watching the streaming video, please feel free to chime in with questions, and hopefully we can get some interaction that way. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Blair for some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. And I don't know if it doesn't sound like it's on, but...
Oh, that's green light. That makes it. I thought I'd just kind of frame this by starting by saying that I kind of resent the title of the panel, Uncle Sam's Broadband Plan, because I seem to recall 5 years ago somebody actually wrote one. Don't know who. But I would say, there's another way in which I actually don't, and I'm very grateful that this process is going forward. We certainly aspired to be Uncle Sam's Broadband Plan, but I would say one of the things that we did not succeed in was creating political capital among all the executive agencies for doing some of the things that we really wanted done. Partly that was institutional. The plan probably should not have been done at the FCC. Probably should have been done. I probably should have worked for Tom at NTIA instead of working for Julius at FCC. Some of that was frankly the way Julius did it. Because he very much wanted to keep that the kind of the White House executive agency to his role, and we didn't do a very good job selling it, frankly, among the institutions. So I'm glad, if you actually look at Chapter 6 of the plan on infrastructure, it calls for this kind of activity. Actually, I think NTI did a good job of building on top of what we did. We certainly didn't do it completely. The second thing, of course, that happened was a month after the plan, the Verizon decision came out, and the FCC spent the next 10 months completely focused on net neutrality. But thankfully, they totally solved that problem, and no one has had to worry about that ever since. But it did kind of kill the momentum for the type of thing we wanted to do. I think the framework is exactly the same as the plan. Let me just say very quickly, the vision of the plan, 17 words: ubiquitous, affordable, abundant broadband or bandwidth with everybody on, and using that platform to better deliver public goods and services. 4 strategies to do so: drive fiber deeper, use spectrum more efficiently, get everybody on, and accelerate certain kinds of public uses in public safety, education, health, etc. The last half of the book is all about that last part. I think the comments focus very much on how do we drive fiber deeper. It doesn't say that, but if you think about what they're asking agencies to do, I think there's a huge upside for the American economy and for our society if the federal governments do a self-examination about how do we lower the cost of inputs of building out networks. In spectrum, we've effectively done that, and by the way, Tom Power will never get the credit he deserves for the AWS auction, which raised $41 billion for the Treasury. He certainly won't get a commission on that, which I'm sure he's very upset about. I would note the Congressional Budget Office scored that auction at 0, so you might think about that when you think about how scoring works, but you also, it was really a tremendous, the NTIA and the White House did a great job pulling together spectrum that people had did not recognize the real value there. You might say it's kind of ironic if I'm saying we're lowering the cost of inputs like spectrum when people had to spend $41 billion for it, but the truth is what that represents is, and partly we haven't done an auction in a long time, and which is one reason we focused on getting spectrum back into the market. When we got to the FCC in 2009, there literally was nothing in the covers for the first time since the beginning of the auction era in 1993. But the point is, for the industry, that is cheaper to spend money on that spectrum than to build out more towers and do other things. So it actually is lowering input costs. Of course, there are a lot of other things that have been going on, the 3.5, the incentive auction, that I think that part of the plan we've done most effectively. But there's a tremendous role for the federal government to think about how they affect other costs, whether access to buildings, access to rights of way. A lot of federal highways, a lot of construction, where if you're laying conduit, you can lower the costs there. And then there are a lot of agencies that, HUD in particular, HHS, that can really drive adoption in various ways too. So I really think this kicks off a very good process. Let me just close by saying that in my experience, there are only 3 periods of time where government actually gets productive things done. One is the first 18 months after a president is elected, because they come in and they're able to do a lot of things. They have a lot of political capital that starts to fade away as we approach the congressional midterms. The second is immediately after a re-election, but that period is pretty short, only about 6 months. And then the third period, ironically, is the last year of a presidential election when the president's not running for re-election because nobody cares about what they're doing, and therefore the agencies can just go ahead and do a lot of stuff, and it's really great. And if you think about it, what that means is the most productive periods is the year of the presidential election when the president's not running and the next 18 months. So while this process, in some sense, I regret that it did not happen immediately after the release of the plan 5 years ago, on the other hand, there is a great opportunity to both do a lot now as well as lay a foundation. And I think a lot of this stuff is very bipartisan, so that whoever is elected, they can really build on that which is not done in the next, roughly speaking, 18 months, can still be done. And I think that what you'll see on June 10th when people start to file comments is that there's a very important long-term, not terribly sexy, but nonetheless important agenda that hopefully this administration will be able to execute on.
Thanks, Scott. Excellent. So from Google's perspective, we will be filing comments on June 10th. And we're actually really excited about this because, excuse me, we've been on the ground and in the air deploying broadband networks. We've got the Google Fiber network, and we're doing a lot of trials of unlicensed spectrum uses. And as we roll out these networks, the business catalogs a list of challenges. We won't call them barriers, but challenges to broadband deployment. And so after the White House announced the Broadband Opportunity Council, which some would call the BOC, but we like to think of as the BOPSI, because we know what BOCs are, and this is something different. That it gave us an opportunity to be able to share this list. And it's a fairly extensive list of ways that we can lower the cost of broadband deployment, both fiber and in the spectrum space. And we think, there are a lot of things the federal government can do. We've also been working very closely with cities and municipalities, and there's a lot of work that can be done there as well. So while this particular project focuses on actions the federal government and federal agencies can take, we don't want to lose sight of what can be done at the local level where so much of the activity takes place. As Blair said, we believe this is truly a bipartisan issue. There's very little that you can argue with when you're talking about investment and deployment. It's good for everybody. It's good for the economy. There's particulars that there might be disagreement on, especially in the adoption space, but in the deployment space, there should not be disagreement between the parties. And so the way that we're looking at this is focusing on three kind of catchphrases. The country should be fiber ready, wireless ready, and consumer ready. And just about everything that we're going to propose falls into those three buckets. So a lot of our comments will focus on the fiber side. We have an extensive list of issues that we've run into on the ground as we've been deploying around the country. And those include things like access to rights-of-way, access to poles and conduits. The FCC has done some work, and a lot of it was recommended in the National Broadband Plan, to decrease the amount of time it takes to access poles, to give more rights and faster rights and lower costs to competitors who are deploying new networks. But there's still a lot of work that can be done. And I won't get into the very granular proposals that we'll have, but there's still a fair amount that needs to be done. That includes pole access and conduit access. One of the biggest issues that we've confronted as we've been out there deploying fiber is access to information. So we're hoping that one of the key components of what this Interagency Council focuses on is transparency and collecting and making information available. So that means where there's a current infrastructure. Sometimes you'd be surprised, it's really difficult to find that out. A lot of these older networks were built at a time where there wasn't electronic or digital tracking of where the networks were built. So you don't even know where the poles are, you don't know where the conduit is. We're not proposing that there becomes a national database because there's issues associated with that, but that providers actually collect that information and make it available. It speeds up the process when you're deploying a new network, when you actually know where you need to connect. And of course, Blair mentioned this as well, in the transportation, National Highway Transportation, Dig Once policies. Also very surprising, we don't have uniform Dig Once policies around the country. That means where the road's being opened up, where you're deploying new highway, new roads, we would like to see policies that enable the deployment of a large conduit so that new providers can go in and access that conduit when you are deploying your network around the country. There's also an area that we believe needs some focus, and that's access to video content. Sounds sort of strange, But talking to our fiber business, one of the things that we've realized as we've deployed around the country is that consumers want the video content that they're used to accessing through MVPDs. And it's quite difficult as a new entrant to get access to that content at reasonable rates. And we've got co-op systems in place and other program access and retransmission consent rules that are in place, but they're not effective for new entrants. Okay. So we believe there needs to be a re-examination of these policies. Again, we're not asking for new regulations, we're asking for reform. So sometimes we're asking for regulations to be removed, and sometimes we're asking for a fresh look at regulations that are in place so that they make better sense in this new world where you've got new entrants deploying fiber and over-the-top video providers and new types of service that we didn't have even 5 years ago when Blair wrote the National Broadband Plan. And then we're also going to include in our document that we file a number of proposals that go to how the federal government can deploy Wi-Fi in and around government buildings, not just government office buildings, but government-owned and leased buildings, so that that Wi-Fi access is available to users both in the building and around the building. And so different ways that you can encourage more deployment, just as being a federal government user, that the wireless access will be there. And then on wireless, I assume that Tom will talk more about spectrum policies, but we've been really engaged on some of the unlicensed spectrum issues. And one of the things that's really important for us to see is a positive mix of both licensed and unlicensed spectrum use. We think that the ecosystem today is getting more vibrant and healthier, and that's in part because federal policies have done a good job at balancing both these uses. And the Commission's 3.5 proceeding, the order that they issued a month or so ago, I think was a really important step forward in allowing for dynamic spectrum sharing. And being able to do that and seeing those kinds of policies are important to bringing the country to a place where we can say we're really wireless ready. And then the final pillar of our policies will be consumer ready, and that's digital literacy, digital inclusion, access to hardware, those types of issues, which in many ways are some of the most difficult issues to address. As we deploy Google Fiber around the country, we often hear from cities and community groups that they want us to do more to address digital literacy and digital inclusion, and that's really hard to do as a single provider. We need communities involved, we need governments involved. There needs to be consistent encouragement and policies around the country. Some of this may be the Lifeline reforms that Chairman Wheeler spoke of yesterday, but there needs to be more done there, and we're working very closely with community groups. So consumer ready may not be so much on the national front, but it's a super important part. You know, there have been a number of surveys that have shown that a lot of people don't purchase broadband, not necessarily because of the cost, but because of relevancy. And you know, as governments do more online, and the way that you apply for jobs and the way that you interact with your government is through online resources, you know, people need to know how to use those resources, and they need to have the tools, laptops and handsets to be able to do that. So we're going to include some discussion about that, and it's also a really important part of Google's efforts as we deploy fiber around the country.
Going last is always a challenge because I had this wonderful framing of this whole thing and they just stole my thunder. So I think we're pretty much done, Doug. I think I'll focus a bit more on process. I think this is a good initiative, and I think it's wise the way the administration's gone about doing this, because it's sort of top down and bottom up. It's top down in the sense that it's the president issuing an executive memorandum, and that gets the agency's attention. But it's bottom up the way it's got to be, because the initiatives and programs and other things that agencies can do and the resources they have available to them are known only to those agencies in large measure. There's nobody sort of sitting on top of all this who can have really deep insight into HUD and Commerce and the Department of Interior and all the different agencies that might have a role to play here. That's got to come from below. So I like the idea that that's exactly how this thing was structured, and then getting public input through the RFC from NTIA as well. I think is a really helpful way to go about it. And each of these agencies has a different things to bring, right? Some have money, right? Or US has money available, and maybe other agencies too. GSA has rooftops and other physical, property that can be used as a platform for broadband deployment. And then the other agencies are sort of in the middle. They just have policies that might be able to be tweaked to help promote broadband deployment. One of the challenges is sort of sustaining this effort. If you're a broadband advocate, you want broadband policy sort of built into everything the agency's doing, sort of broadband by design, if you will. Blair mentioned when the broadband plan came out, and there were a number of recommendations along the lines we're going to be talking about today and that are going to be identified in this proceeding. And I agree that we didn't make the most of that opportunity from the administration's perspective to really push the agencies. I think from NTIA's perspective, it was because BTOP had taken a lot of the air out of the room, and that was a big focus for us. But because you need that sustained commitment, the broadband is not the number one priority of most, or perhaps any of these agencies. If your job is to protect the fish and wildlife in some sanctuary, you're not thinking about, okay, and broadband too, or if your job is to protect the Defense Department installation somewhere, the idea of thinking about broadband and contractors coming on and installing equipment, that's really not consistent with what your sort of day-to-day job is. So it takes a sustained effort and regular pushing. And I think this is why the Spectrum success we've had is because we had a concentrated effort throughout the agencies, very much focused on that, starting with an executive memorandum and then legislation. That's the kind of sustained effort you really need to keep these things going. So I would hope that maybe next year something like this could happen again, that the White House could lead some effort to go back to the agencies and say, okay, here's what we said and did last year. How are we doing this year? You need to just keep building it in. And what's interesting is, there's some you can see areas where agencies do have certain practices built in, right? When the government hires, there's always a veterans preference. That's just built in by law. It's just built in, but it's always there. Another one that is of particular relevance here is anytime the federal government is involved in any kind of land excavation, any disturbing of the earth, there has to be a historic and environmental review to make sure you're not disrupting environmentally sensitive land or historically sensitive property. That's built in, right? That's by design every time. So that's great if that's your issue. Interestingly, that is one of the things that broadband deployers run into as a challenge, because you see different agencies administering those rules in different ways, and sometimes long delays in those processes. That's not to diminish the importance of those concerns, but when different agencies do them in different ways, and when there's no transparency into how it's getting done, it's a real challenge. But I raise the topic to say, not only is broadband not always the highest priority for agencies, but they often have other priorities that are just different or even inconsistent with promoting broadband. That's can be frustrating, but that's just the way it is. I mean, we've all got probably everybody in this room would tend towards putting the pedal to the metal a little bit more on broadband, but there's probably a conference going on down the street somewhere where people are talking about how broadband is destroying the environment or something like that, right? So it's that coordinated effort, it's that sustained effort that I think has to be brought to it. And I would hope, I wish we could have done a better job 5 years ago when the plan came out, because there really were some good ideas there, and maybe some would have gotten traction, maybe some wouldn't have. But if we'd started then and kept pushing, who knows where we'd be today. But as Blair said, now's a good time too. So I congratulate the administration and the agencies who are doing this, and I hope I'm glad to see it's in good hands at NTIA, we hope to continue the effort. We'll certainly be supporting whatever it is we can identify. We'll obviously have a bit of a wireless bent from the CTIA perspective, but Blair and Stacy and all of you know the impact of broadband and what it means for the economy and for connecting Americans. So we totally support the effort. And Doug, thanks for putting this event on, because this is the kind of thing we also need to do to keep the momentum going.
If I could just offer a thought on, I think your point about sustainability is really important, and sustainability sometimes is a function of accountability. The most successful country doing broadband on all the different dimensions is Korea. They're serious about it. They're not interested in, well, they probably are interested in press, but they have an annual review. They have a dedicated group. They have metrics. Singapore similarly has a very serious, methodical way of doing this. Part of the problem we faced in dealing with the other agencies, I'll use the Department of Transportation. To me, the dig once is the most obvious, simplest. There's just no reason not to do it. The incremental cost of putting in conduit when you're building a road is pretty close to zero. The benefit down the road is very high. And yet we couldn't get the Department of Transportation to do it because they had no accountability for it. There was no one above them measuring them for that. And to be quite candid, I wanted the FCC every year on the occasion of the anniversary of the plan to, at the March meeting, say how we doing. And I told the chairman's staff I would come and take full responsibility for lots of errors. I have no problem doing it. I'm not running for office. I don't care about these things. On the 1 year anniversary, I actually gave a speech saying here's the mistakes we made. But the chairman's office didn't want to be accountable, so they didn't do it. And if you can't get the very agency that wrote it to be accountable to itself, you can understand why the Department of Transportation certainly doesn't want to be accountable, or HHS doesn't want to be accountable. So one of the things that certainly in the filing that I'll do on June 10th, but it'll be interesting to see whether the White House has the political will institutionally to actually hold agencies accountable for certain kinds of metrics. And I guess that's a final point. When you say accountability, you also imply a certain kind of metric by which you will be held accountable. And one of the really great things kind of tactically that occurred, and I give, frankly, Larry Summers and Peter Orszag and Jason Furman, who worked in the administration, a lot of credit for understanding the importance of spectrum to the economy, getting the president to sign an executive order, because once you had that goal, it gave Tom the ability to negotiate with other departments with the stamp of the president really being behind it. So that's an example of how the process can work. Whether it can work on these other things, I think there's a lot of good momentum, but it remains to be seen.
So Blair, I think you already answered my first question. I was hoping to just go down the line and get your number one policy issue, the one change that you would like to come out of this that you think is most important. It seems part of the problem is we're trying to cut across so many different agencies, so many different issues, that there's, potentially a very long list of policy changes. But I'm curious if number one, if nothing else comes out of this, what's the one change you make? And maybe if it's the same for all three, we'll know what we need to be doing. So if it's dig once conduit for you, Blair, is that the answer? And accountability behind it.
It's probably dig once, but I have to say, because I'm actually in the process of writing this, it'll be interesting to see what I think by June. Part of the things that I really learned in the plan was there's a real value to process where you don't know the answer ahead of time. In Washington, pretty much everybody knows the answer ahead of time. I'm not one of those people, but so I would say dig once, but it could well be that there's some, if you look at, for example, the amount of money from HUD that goes into housing, obviously putting broadband, fiber, very good broadband and Wi-Fi into those buildings at the start is not that expensive, and you're going to have to do it eventually. So maybe that turns out to be the big lever. I don't know. One of the reasons why I was really looking forward to being here was to hear what everyone else thinks. So.
Looking for the answers.
Yeah.
We're sort of in the same camp as Blair. We've got a 18, 20-page document that we're working on. So we think all of those things are really important. A fairly, I wouldn't say comprehensive list, because I'm sure there's issues that we're missing, and we're anxious to see what other people file. But access to infrastructure. You know, if you think about a lot of the proposals that we'll focus on and that other people will focus on will include the government making access more available to HUD programs, to EPA programs, Department of Transportation programs. But if the primary focus is to get private industry to invest and deploy, then you've got to have access to rights of way, infrastructure. Everything that's out there can be an impediment, and we don't want that current infrastructure to be an impediment. We want it to be helpful. And lowering the cost and lowering the effort to get that access is pretty high on our list of priorities.
Yeah, I agree, and it's interesting. I mean, DIC once is obviously a form of access to infrastructure.
Right.
It's broader than that, and you've got both the federal and the local officials involved. There's only so much at the federal level you can solve on the local rights-of-way issue, but it's a big issue on the federal side. One of our wireless carriers has told me that when they are looking for deployment of a new tower, if they eye some private property where they think they can go and lease the space and build the tower, from the moment they identify the property through leasing and construction is usually around 18 months to 2 years. On federal property, it's 4 years. It really makes them think twice about even bothering. And then once you find a property, how you go about the process of getting access varies from each agency. It varies within agencies, depending on, is it the Northwest Field Office or the Southeast Field Office you're talking to. Everything about it changes. The way different agencies do the historic environmental review that I talked about before varies between offices. What's interesting about this is already the subject of a presidential executive order from a couple of years ago, where the president said, let's streamline this, let's make it more uniform. And there have been efforts underway, and there's progress being made there, to be sure. But it's really challenging, and it goes to one of the process challenges here. If all we did was make sure that RUS is doling out money more efficiently and making sure that GSA is making access to their rooftops better, and HUD builds Wi-Fi into subsidized housing, like they could all do their little rifle shot approaches, and that'd be great. But some of these are cross-cutting. The problem with the cross-cutting ones is they're just much harder, because you got to get all the agencies together who are typically focused on completely different priorities to try to get them all together. And everybody says, that's great, we should have a uniform form and process, make it our form and process, and we're totally with you. And that's what you hear from all the agencies. But I would say access, what the federal government can do, and the biggest thing they can do is promote access to federal lands and property. And I want to give some credit. There is process being made. Different agencies are more efficient than others, and they have their challenges, right? I mean, if you want to put a tower on some public property in the Northwest, and the last employee there who used to manage those forms retired, and they didn't have the budget to replace him, that's a problem. That's a challenge. So they've got their challenges, but I think just making it uniform and standard would be a big plus. And then I do think on the sustainability piece that Blair and I and Stacey, we've all mentioned, I think if one thing that came out of this was a commitment to look at this again in a year, regardless of the substantive ideas we come up with, I think just that commitment would be a big plus.
So I'm going to dig in a little deeper on this issue of where the greater impediments really lie, whether they're at the federal level or at the state or local level. Blair, with your Gig.U project, obviously been thinking about those issues a lot. Stacey, I'm sure Google has. So yeah, I'm curious. I mean, it seems like we don't want to run into just straight up issues of federalism and have long legal battles about federal versus state or local power. So what can we do around best practices, developing best practices for state or what are we already doing?
Well, first of all, I'm a big believer in game theory rather than regulation, because I see how it works, and I think anybody who's actually understood what Google Fiber was doing would understand it. I'm not going to go into a full discussion of that. That's a topic for another time. except to point out that the kind of process problems that we've all pointed to, it's so fascinating to watch how Google Fiber changed the equation. One of the things I didn't have an appreciation, I knew that cities had rules that, shall we say, suppressed the deployment of wired networks, but I didn't fully understand that until I saw what Google Fiber did, and then we saw the same thing with Gig.U, in which we have to remember cities are the monopoly provider of construction management services. I don't mean the actual management of construction, I mean the kind of meta management. That is to say, you actually can't construct a large-scale project like Google Fiber without the city's permission. In the old days, the way it worked was the city wanted something, would grant a monopoly to a cable franchise, or there was the larger state monopoly to the telephone franchise. There was an exchange, universal service, access to rights of way. But the company was indifferent as to how the construction went because it was just built into the rate base. Didn't matter because it was a monopoly provider. Google comes in and basically creates a scarce resource, which is fiber. It shouldn't have been scarce, but it was in 2010 when they started the Google Fiber project. And every city wants it. 1,100 cities apply. But the price of doing it is not writing a check as the NFL would have. That would have been the way the NFL would have monetized their scarcity. The price was you have to upgrade your systems. And one of the cities we were negotiating with on the Gig.U side, it was fascinating because I just couldn't believe this wasn't already true. When you do a construction project, you constantly have to have changes. You would want to do those electronically. And yet the city required paper, which took more time and was more costly. And basically the service provider was saying, we're not going to, it wasn't Google, by the way, we're not going to do this project unless you let us do this electronically. And the city finally said, well, sure, why not? I guess so. No one else had ever requested it because it didn't really matter, or we didn't really care enough to do it, but now we'll do it. So I think that there are, clearly cities affect the economics of deployment more than the federal government because you basically construct city by city, and the rights of way rules, the construction management rules, those are very, very big things. But having said that, it's not actually one thing. Stacey and I were chatting earlier about how the New York Times is focusing on Netflix today about how they have won these policy battles. The truth is, there were lots of different reasons why Netflix ended up on the winning side of net neutrality or Title II and the Comcast merger, but we tend to always want stories that are about the silver bullet, about the villain, about the hero. They're in this particular space, it's lots and lots of things that drive the cost of deployment down, that lower the cost of inputs, that give us affordable, abundant bandwidth. And we ought to be focused on all of them, but that's really hard in a government process. The cities, I would say, order of magnitude in terms of governance effect, about 80%, but the 20% can sometimes be the difference between a project moving forward and one not moving forward.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the federal government can set up a set of best practices. I'm hoping that nobody's going to ask for some blanket preemption, but the federal government can set up the best practices. They can show the cities and localities the best way to move forward. But as Blair said, most of the work on the ground and when you're deploying fiber networks is in the cities. And there have been a number of best practices that have been put in written form. There's the Google Fiber City Checklist. Gig.U has documents. Fiber to the Home Council has documents. They're all fairly consistent, giving the mayors and the cities list of fairly easy things to understand, not necessarily easy things to execute on. But we have found that the clearer that we are about what it takes for a city to move at Google speed, the more appealing it is to deploy in those areas. I was on a panel at the beginning of the year at CES with someone from Verizon, and I thought this was a really nice compliment. And he said, when Verizon went in to deploy Fios, we went in and said, what do we need to do? And we took the list and we started doing it. And when Google went in and said, do you want us? Because if you want us, let us help you figure out a way to make this move faster, to be more efficient, to be better for the people who live in this community. We didn't ask for special favors. We didn't say do this just for us. We said this will make it so that lots of people will want to come in and deploy fiber. Get rid of some of these old regulations that made sense only in a monopoly environment. Look for something different. Look for things like deploying Wi-Fi to community centers rather than paying a fee for PEG channels. Things like that make sense in today's world when the regulations that were on the books were old regulations. And as Blair said, cities were really excited about it. They wanted to streamline their regulations. They wanted to streamline their permitting processes. And that's the way I think we all need to be thinking about it going forward.
I'm just going to echo this. I mean, this is exactly what the wireless carriers and CJA have been doing, reaching out to communities on tower siting issues and developing best practices and working with some of the national organizations that represent state and local communities. At the same time, Congress came in and passed a law that the FCC has implemented that is now in court because communities are challenging it. So these federalism issues are always lurking in the background. Those things will work themselves out. With or without litigation and legislation, though, I do think this idea that both Stacey and Blair touched on, the industry has to be comfortable going in and saying, "Here's what we need. Like, let's not hide the ball here. This is what we need. This is what makes sense." I think most of the folks at the local level, they know broadband and wireless adds to the economy, adds to productivity, and even in rural areas, and particularly in rural areas where the need is great, and you might not have a big campus or a big industry going on there, but you have tourism, and folks go out to West Virginia because it's beautiful and they want a vacation there, but you lose your cell coverage. Well, let's fix that. So there's always, I think there's almost always recognition of the value of this. It's just folks at the local level who don't deal with this every day don't understand the demands and the needs and what does it really mean. And if there's any pushback coming from anywhere within the community, the local elected folks and zoning officials are going to be a little more sympathetic to their local people than the company from Seattle or Kansas City or wherever the big company is coming from. So it's up to us to educate folks, and we've been very aggressive in doing so, and very happy with the response we've gotten from a lot of those state and local folks.
So here's I guess this sort of falls into a similar divide of local versus federal issue, but if we can dive into the issue of adoption, to what extent can federal best practices help drive sort of those issues of digital literacy? By some measures, we still have 30% of Americans that aren't online, which strikes me as a surprisingly large number. To what extent can the Opportunity Council drive those best practices in addition to what NTIA is already doing?
I know one of the things Blair pointed to 5 years ago was just talking about how as the government moves its own services online, it'll promote adoption because folks need to get online to transact whatever business they have with the government. And most of us, even if it's just getting your your taxes filed or your sticker for your car, or there's always things like that, and then other folks have much more engagement with the government. I think that's one way, and of course we're pushing agencies to particularly think about the mobile side of that and making sure that websites and services are available via mobile platforms, because the statistics are pretty clear that a lot of folks who do depend on government services at lower income levels are much more likely to be mobile only. And so pushing the agencies on that is probably something we're going to be talking about in our comments.
I certainly, this part I agree with what we wrote 5 years ago, but I don't think actually the adoption section, as I said in the 1 year anniversary, I don't think we were creative enough. It was my fault, not the staff's fault. But I think when we talk about incentives, we have to understand both carrots and sticks. I think we want to both help people get online. I think we kind of need a surge of government effort, and this is at the federal, state, and local level, to get people online. Because if you think about every enterprise, they are all trying to basically do all their work online. It's not only is it more efficient in terms of how you operate it, it's much more effective because you're capturing data. You know, I'm on the board of a nonprofit, for example, called Case Commons, and the idea is bring the digital platform to social work. It's funded primarily by the Pew I'm sorry, not the Pew Foundation. I'm blanking on the name of the foundation, but they're the leading foundation on child's welfare. But the point is, there's an apocryphal story where in Baltimore, some family that was on assistance had to tell their life story 29 different times, and you had 29 different multiple pages of legal pads talking, so that if there was an emergency, do you call this uncle at this wrong phone number, or do you call this doctor who's now, I mean, the point is, if you have it on the digital platform right from the start, you can provide those services much better. It proves to be a very difficult task, but if the government gets their act together that way and then encourages people to do it, the government can do its work more effectively. But the government, unlike private enterprise, has to serve everybody. So the government absolutely benefits by getting everybody on, and we need a strategy in which we essentially capture the benefit, the cost savings of getting everybody online, and then front-loading those into the payment to drive people online. And that's a more complicated thing we have to go into today, though I'll probably talk about it a bit in the comments that I'll file. But I think every one of those agencies ought to be thinking about, how could I do our job better if I didn't have to worry about, if I assume everyone's online, what can we do better? How do we save that money? But then how do we use that savings in 5 years to today spend to get people online? That's what any business would do, but government, because of the way they budget, it's much harder to do it, but that's the opportunity this process creates.
And you know, these programs that Tom and Blair talked about, we think are incredibly important. And I said this in my opening remarks. This isn't something that can be solved by the federal government. It's going to take a village. It sounds cliche, but it's the community centers and local groups and churches and schools and everybody that benefits from having their constituencies online need to be involved. One of the things that we have found at Google is that local organizations are really excited about educational programs. We have found when we're working with community college students, upper level high school students, making sure that they have tremendous digital literacy skills, it becomes viral. So they go home and they teach their parents. They go to the churches and they work with the congregation and teach the congregation, because moving government services online is great, but it doesn't work if the users don't know how to access those services. And so this, you know, every component of it, from you know, e-government to digital literacy to access to devices and the whole community support, is incredibly important.
Well, so yesterday, as you could read in the front page of the New York Times, the FCC came out with the beginning of the process to reform Lifeline. And part of the idea is to move it from being a subsidy for voice to a subsidy for broadband. But another part of the idea is, instead of just paying for a specific service, you essentially give a voucher. One of the advantages, and this was not at all discussed yesterday, but one of the advantages of doing a voucher is, if you think about it from a church's point of view, if a church wants to be able to communicate more effectively with its members, it wants everybody on, and it wants to be able to, you know, send emails and stuff. So that if you think about certain churches where, if there are certain members who can't afford it are getting that $10 subsidy, if the church itself can add another couple bucks to that, and then you have maybe the city providing a different service adding a couple more bucks, you suddenly get a very efficient way of having a kind of like shifting the costs and getting institutions that benefit from having folks online effectively subsidize people. So instead of having to send out mailers through the post office, you are effectively communicating directly online, but you are helping the people who need it make sure that they have that. So that's one of the benefits that, you know, we'll have to see how it plays out, but hopefully we can actually take advantage of the platform to drive the platform.
So why don't we pause here and see if there are any questions from the audience, if anyone has any thoughts they'd like to add. Please.
I'll introduce myself first off. Some of you know me. I'm Kerry Hinton with the DC Public Service Commission. It's good seeing all of you again. And I wanted to pick up actually on 2 points. First, I'm going to resist the temptation to defend local governments and their obstinance, shall we say, in dealing with the issues that oftentimes have been relevant in other jurisdictions, but we don't believe it perhaps has been as relevant here in the district, where we have had a Dig Once program for over a decade, and we've had difficulty in getting particularly the CLECs to participate in it on a timely basis. It's not so relevant to wireless carriers, but it's been oftentimes difficult to get the companies to come in all at the same time. But be that as it may, what I wanted to focus on was the second point, and again, Blair has somewhat minimized, shall we say, the significance of the chapter that dealt with broadband adoption in the national plan. But from our perspective, it was significant because it did raise that issue to a national level. But the problem has been that we've gone 5 years since the plan without the FCC really coming forward with a straw man proposal. Thank you. And it appears that's what we're going to be seeing as a result of the next open meeting at the FCC. My question really is to Stacy and to Tom, and perhaps Blair. I'd appreciate if you'd also opine on this, because you were talking about essentially the voucher system that I believe AT&T had originally proposed to the FCC. Do you think that will work? And specifically, from what I've seen in the trade press, is that the FCC is not proposing to increase the dollar amount of the value of that voucher from what is currently provided for Lifeline voice service, that being $9.25. So specifically to Stacy, what is the price of broadband service that Google offers in the areas that you're serving? And do you think $9.25 voucher will be significant enough to enable low-income residents in the areas that you serve to now obtain or to obtain in the future broadband service from Google? And then from Tom, and maybe too early that you've been at CTIA to be able to have a lot of in-depth knowledge on this, but do you think wireless carriers will be able to be in a similar position with the $9.25 voucher of being able to facilitate low-income consumers to obtain wireless broadband service?
So first I wanted to clarify, we don't think cities have been difficult. We actually really like working with the cities. We think cities have a lot of policies in place that were designed and implemented at a time where there wasn't somebody coming in and building a brand new fiber network. So we think the cities have been great to work with. Just wanted to clarify that. In terms of pricing for the broadband access, Google Fiber has different pricing in different cities based on construction costs and the cost to deliver the service. But we have a basic tier, and the basic tier today is a one-time construction fee and either a low monthly fee or no monthly fee. And we're a business. We talk a lot internally about making sure that we can deliver a service that will entice low-income users, people who might not see the value of broadband today, and we want to bring them onto the network. It's not the gigabit service that we sell, that's a higher price, but it's an entry-level basics tier. And we pay attention to what the federal government is doing. We pay attention to subsidy programs and to broadband definitions and everything that the FCC is doing to encourage broadband adoption and greater speeds. And so the pricing may change, depending upon what we decide is the best way to bring these users online. Our basic tier does not have income qualifications. We want to make sure that people have an entry-level point and can have an opportunity to try the service. And we also want to make sure that people who want to use the more robust service that has all the video programming and everything else associated with it can purchase that gigabit service at a higher rate as well. So The price point is not dependent on what the government sets, of course, but we're mindful of what's going on.
Yeah, for wireless, different carriers are going to approach it differently. So it's hard to have a single answer to that. $9.25 is obviously a lot less than what I pay for my wireless service. And so I think we'll have to just see the details of the plan.
I think everybody really wants to know what you pay for a wireless service. That would be really revealing. Yeah, I was going to say, you have to pay anything? Gee.
Well, here's the answer. Do you mean this one or this one? So we'll have to see, but certainly some wireless carriers are very focused on supporting and working with the FCC on Lifeline and providing service to Lifeline subscribers. One of the things that we're lucky to be able to tout on the wireless side is that you do have a lot of choice on the wireless side. You have, I think it's 83% of the country has access to 4 wireless providers. And so it's not, on the wired side, folks are often more dependent on 1, maybe 2, depending on where you live, sometimes 3 or 4. But so I don't have a real specific answer. There's obviously pressure on the FCC to limit the size of the fund, and then you have folks looking at examples of abuse and waste in the fund, and so there's concern about the fund growing over here while the commission still has work to do to rein in some of that abuse. They've done significant work in that regard, particularly making sure that we don't have folks double dipping. They've done some good work there and really reduced the size of the abuse there. Eligibility is a challenge, and a lot of that burden rests on the carriers to determine eligibility, and then the carriers are held responsible if they make mistakes in determining eligibility. So it would be helpful if we could clean up that process too. But to your question, $9.25 certainly makes a difference in the lives of a lot of people. It's obviously not gonna do it for everyone.
Just a couple quick comments. First of all, I don't need to diminish the significance of the adoption part of the plan. I thought actually, as the first federal government articulation of why everybody needs to be on it, actually did a very useful thing. I was just saying in terms of actually the policies, we didn't go far enough. However, we went a lot farther than the FCC went for 5 years. So in that sense, I wish the FCC had immediately started reforming the Lifeline program, but I'm glad that Tom Wheeler, and also, by the way, I think Clyburn did a terrific job framing it last November. And I think I'm troubled by the initial coverage, painting it as kind of a partisan thing, because I was at her speech. It was at the American Enterprise Institute. There were a lot of Republicans who were very in favor of what she articulated, and I think still are. So I think the initial reporting kind of fell into the unfortunate frame of everything is partisan, when in fact there's a lot of bipartisanship in terms of, and hopefully we'll get back to that. Let me just also say as to cities, because you actually raised an important point. A number of conservative friends have said cities just need to deregulate how they do things. They need to deregulate the rights of way. That is, and they say that Google's done that. That is not what Google has done. What Google has done, and what we try to do with Gig.U, and in fact we're coming out with a handbook in June, and this is at the core of it. In any business negotiation, and I spent a lot of time in my early career doing those, what you look for is a certain kind of asymmetry of value creation, where party A is willing to do something because it doesn't cost them that much, but there's tremendous benefit to party B, and party B is willing to do that, and it tremendously benefits party A. So, in other words, it's kind of that 1 + 1 = 5 kind of negotiation, which pretty much every business negotiation in some form or fashion, except in bankruptcy court, is designed to do that. And what Google and the cities did was they took a look at how are we actually approaching construction management, rights of way policies, access to facilities, etc. What are the things that cost cities almost nothing, and certainly don't cost them in terms of OpEx, but yet create tremendous potential value for the city? That's the right way to approach it. That is, and I agree with Stacy, the great thing about what Google has done, and now I think Verizon and AT&T and CenturyLink and others are starting to understand this, is if you actually hold something the city wants as a prospect, if that's the carrot, then you can actually have a more vibrant negotiation. I would never advise the city to suddenly just say, we'll just assume that if we change this, somebody steps in. Because we had a lot of gig.u cities who offered that and we couldn't find someone to come in. But if you can find a party that's willing to do certain things, then absolutely. So I think it really should be thought of not as deregulation, but rather as kind of reform and negotiation.
Hi, my name is, oh, I'm so loud. My name is Jennifer Jalogat. I own a boutique communications and tech law firm in the DC area. And so I've been following this area and this topic for quite some time. And I was around during the National Broadband Plan when you released it, Blair. And I also represented some clients when the NTIA and RUS had the BTOP and the BIP program. Unfortunately, they didn't get it. So I've been in and out in terms of following this area. And I was a little bit disappointed because I didn't see any major outcome. The only buzz that I started to hear about is when Google Fiber came in, and essentially when they moved into markets, the incumbents and other competitors, saw them moving in and said, okay, let's go in, there may be something here. So when I heard about this, the new council and the new funding that the administration's putting towards broadband deployment and, cutting down barriers to broadband access and adoption in communities and underserved communities, I was a little skeptical because I said, I didn't see much progress. I didn't hear much about the previous efforts. So my question to you all on the panel is, what can this new council and these new efforts from these new agencies and partnership with the private sector do differently from the last program to make it more successful? I like the Dig First proposal that you talked about earlier.
Well, first of all, I would say, whereas again, I'm a big fan of Google Fiber, and you're exactly right about the response of the incumbents, and I would note the single most amusing fact about the game of gigs to me is that a couple of years ago, all the incumbents said they'd never do it, and of the 34 communities where Google has announced that they're either negotiating or offering a gig, in 100% of those communities, the incumbent telco has said they're going to do it. And now by most of them, the cable guys have said they're going to do it, which means that within 18 months, we're going to have two kinds of communities in this country, those who have no gig options and those who have 3. Now, if you understand that, what you understand is the power of competition. But your question, I think, goes to I think there's actually been a lot of successful things that take a great deal of time, and the media does not cover them well. But certainly on the spectrum front, if you look at where we were in 2009 and look at where we are now, we are going to be very proud of what Tom did while he was at NTIA and OSTP. And what a lot of others did. This administration, and by the way, I did not say this on the first or second anniversary. I was actually very nervous about how this would come forward. But I think in the last couple of years, we've made a lot of progress on spectrum. I think we're going to look back with some pride about what's happened in fiber. A lot of that was driven by Google. Google, by the way, that project came out of discussions we had with them in the plan, but they deserve all the credit because they put the capital there. And I think that where we have fallen down, or where I think there needs to be greater effort, is on the adoption and on the usage side. And but even there, on the usage side, there are various things the government has done, the green button, the blue button, and some of these ways of using apps, I think are positive. I think we're going to see changes in 911 that are really valuable. Obviously, healthcare is still not there in terms of how it uses the platform, but it will get there. Education will get there. E-rate reform, I think, is something we'll look back and be proud of in a few years when we see how that catalyzes an ecosystem. But these are not things where these are neither the kind of the moments where you have kind of the drama of 9/11 in terms of the clear problem, nor is it BED, right? Because you never declare victory. It is you have to have a focus not on the short press release driven kind of ribbon cutting, but on the long term getting it done. Again, this is why I think the Koreans and the Singaporeans are so terrific. They focus on that long term, on that constant improvement, and that's the way we ought to have that mindset. It is very difficult in this government and in this town at this time to do that, but it's just you have to measure it differently.
Blair has been very generous in his comments to me, which I appreciate. I will point out, but hopefully this doesn't get too gooey, but I did have the benefit. I will take some credit only because that's basically all I did for 3 years in the White House, and so if I can't point to something, you would be fair to ask some questions. I did have the benefit of the White House behind me, and I take my hat off to guys like Blair who just goes out with a good idea like you and just goes and does it. So I thank you, but Blair, you've obviously been a leader in all things broadband and tech for a long time. To the question, I just keep coming back to the same point, and I'll point to the spectrum thing because it was about all I did for 3 years, but there were a lot of other people focused on it too. And I can point to specific people at different agencies, and I will just mention the Defense Department because they are such a big spectrum user and therefore so important to this initiative. But there are a couple folks over there who changed the way DoD thinks about spectrum, and there were good reasons from DoD's selfish perspective, frankly, to do so. But they adopted just a change in mindset, and it worked at DOJ and it worked at DOT and it worked, and of course NTIA, Larry Strickling and the whole team at NTIA. It was a concerted and consistent and sustained effort over several years, and that's what we got right here. So there will be answers. You're sort of looking for individual ideas, and there will be a lot of them. And we've mentioned a few of them here, and I'm sure there are more, and there are probably more pockets of opportunity within various agencies that we haven't even thought about. That's why we're going through this process. But I just keep coming back to the same point that more importantly, it is that we just have to have a sustained effort. You'd love to have like a broadband ombudsman in every agency, right? Being able to do this. When I was in the White House, whenever some good idea would come along, people would just say, well, you're in the White House, just tell them to do it. And I'd be like, okay, I did. Yeah, ta-da! Not that how it works. You really need to sell it within the agencies, and these sustained efforts do pay off. And it's not. The individual initiatives within the agencies are very relevant, but at some stage, in some respects, what's more important is that we just keep pushing the ball down the field. And had we had the opportunity and the smarts to pick up a lot of Blair's recommendations in 2010 and start this process back then, it'd be interesting to see what progress we could have made. But there's no time like the present to be moving along.
So I'm curious, Blair, you mentioned that it looks like we might be moving forward into a world in which there are two different kinds of communities, the ones with 2-3 gigabit players and those with none. So, and it seems like the economics for broadband in rural areas are really tough. What can the Opportunity Council be doing to address this sort of rural-urban divide there, if that can be addressed?
Well, actually, one of the interesting things when you look at the map of where we have fiber, there's a lot of rural communities that have fiber, and that is very much a tribute, I suppose, to the Universal Service Fund. The problem is the Universal Service Fund has a lot of challenges, but it effectively encourages being subscale and inefficient, and that's a challenge. It's also a challenge because there are lots of communities that don't have that, and yet the economics of the traditional wireline telco are undercut by wireless providers. So this will be a continuing challenge. I used to think I knew a fair amount about universal service, in particular the high cost fund. I don't know as much as I did 5 years ago because I've been focused on the affordable, abundant bandwidth, getting everybody on. The use is not the ubiquity piece of it. I will simply say, from afar, I have the following impression, that programs like RUS were done in good faith. Loans were made based on a series of assumptions. Loans were taken out and invested in with a series of assumptions, and those assumptions are no longer valid. In the private sector, what happens is there's a renegotiation between either the investors or the lenders and the entities. Sometimes that happens in bankruptcy court. Sometimes it happens before bankruptcy. Lots of industries. John Malone, who is now a legend, but early on in his cable career, at one point looked at his lenders and basically just said, "Here are the keys. You can have it." And as he was renegotiating loans, it was very early on in the cable industry. We have a situation which will eventually require a restructuring for broadband in rural America, but we don't have yet the mind frame. What I think we need to get to is where people have the incentives on a going forward basis to invest on today's technology for tomorrow's needs. And we don't have that mind frame yet. That is a far more complicated thing than we have time to address. But I think it's a question of how do you align the incentives? And ultimately, the challenge will be negotiating between those who want to get rewarded for what they did yesterday, either in terms of lending or building, and those who want to get rewarded for what they're going to do for tomorrow. That is a constant challenge. I'm not saying how to resolve it, but until we get into the mind frame that what we want to do is reward people who are investing for tomorrow and not simply being rewarded for what they did in the past, how we kind of change that. We are both going to throw a lot of money into things that are never going to be fully utilized, and we're not going to really serve the rural communities the way we need to.
Any other questions from the audience? We've got about 10-15 minutes left. I'm curious, I guess maybe this falls into the same issue of the rural-urban divide, but you mentioned RUS. We're looking at 25 different agencies. Do you think there are any sort of surprise, maybe hidden areas of potential funding that could come out of this project? I don't know, we look at Department of Education, we have Veterans Affairs, stuff like that. Are any areas where maybe we could unlock some money for particular use cases with broadband?
I think the key to identifying them is to find ways where it's not simply the agency sort of being told to try to help broadband, but ways where it really helps the agency do its function better. And one of the things we're looking into, and I really don't have the details yet, but the VA, you mentioned the VA, they are doing some pilot programs around telemedicine. And it can just be a huge win all across the board. Because you have patients who are living in remote areas. Do they want to drive 2 hours to the hospital? So they end up not getting the attention. They don't go to checkups. They don't have. They don't make appointments. It's too much of a hassle. So their health is not as good, and so healthcare costs go up. Or if they do go, the amount of time that's spent is a waste into itself. And for some conditions, post-traumatic stress, maybe you don't want to identify yourself by going to the hospital and walking in that door and sitting in the waiting room. But if you're sitting at home and can do it remotely and have a Skype session, you'll get the treatment you need. And the VA spends money to invest in healthcare for veterans, right? That's one of their top priority. So can they reduce costs and improve outcomes through broadband? And at the same time, you're promoting broadband deployment in those communities. So I think it's looking for the win that's a win for the agency and not just a burden to the agency.
I'd agree with that, and I'll propose another one, which is totally counterintuitive. Prisons, and the reason I say that is, and it's a similar analogy, except much more expensive. That is, every time a prisoner in a federal prison or a state one or a city or a municipal county one has to go outside for health care, and the Government is responsible for taking them outside for healthcare. It's incredibly expensive because you have to have 2 security people with them, right? And you have to drive, and it's very expensive. If you could reduce the number of visits by almost any metric by having really high fidelity, 8K telemedicine, telepresence, it would definitely pay for itself. There's no question but that it would pay for itself. There's a big political obstacle to the notion that we actually want prisons to have really great broadband. But if you think about it, the fundamental challenge of prisons is you need to isolate people for both security and justice reasons, but you don't want to isolate them because you want to keep them engaged in society so they can actually come out. This is a real challenging thing in an analog world. It's not that challenging in a digital world because you can isolate them, but you can also, with broadband, give them access to all kinds of educational stuff. By the way, that's expensive too. But Khan Academy, whatever, healthcare for things, all kinds of different things, and you can also make the prisons more secure. But that's one where there's been very little creative process. In fact, one of the things that's weird to me is the FCC continues its efforts to lower prison rates, and there's a lot of value to that. I'm just saying, I was chief of staff at the FCC in 1996 when we were talking about the cost of a per-minute long-distance phone call. No one outside of prisons has talked about the cost of a per-minute phone call since about 2001, right? We spent a lot of time in 96 talking in the Act and afterwards about what that meant. It's just gone away. And I'm saying, why are we still talking about that with prisons? Why aren't we just flooding the zone with bandwidth and solving the problem that way? And I think the Justice Department, if they thought about it that way, now the prisons tend to be isolated so you wouldn't drive that much deployment, but they're actually in some rural areas you might end up driving deployment in some interesting ways. But again, it's a lot of, Tom's exactly right, you have to give them incentives for how they can do their job better within their own terms. But it's a bunch of smaller things as opposed to one single big thing.
Great. With that, Stacy, do you want to?
Well, I just wanted to point out kind of the theme here, and that is, and I think this goes to your question a little bit, this time around there's not a big chunk of money that the government's going to be handing out. So looking for creative ways to be more efficient, looking for ways to spur innovation in the private sector, that's where the money's going to come from. It's going to come from savings. It's going to come from efficiencies, and not a big federal government program, which is okay, because that pressure to be able to do things in more innovative, creative ways, like Google is doing trial runs with weather balloons to deliver broadband access in remote areas, and it's well underway. Things are moving along, and it's been successful thus far. And where we've tested it, that's the kind of innovation that you want to spur, rather than handing a provider a sum of money and saying, "Go do things according to this plan."
And I think that matches up with what Blair said in terms of rewarding people for what you're going to do in innovation. You see in the startup community, that's what they do. It's come up with an idea, whether someone wants it or not, and so we're going to create it, versus the government approach and traditional approach we've done in the past, the way incumbents are rewarded, versus for their legacy investment. So that's like the shift. It's a difference. And so you're saying the future is just rewarding like people who are innovative and changing versus like the incumbents.
Yeah, well, it's if you think, I got into this argument with the Department of Agriculture while we were doing the plan. RUS basically, they lend money to companies, and then they go to the FCC and say, if you don't up universal service payments to these companies, they'll go belly up, and then they won't be able to pay our loans, and the taxpayers will lose. And I go, well, wait a minute, that's a little bit weird. Like, why did you lend them money if you didn't think they could repay the loan? And they said, well, we thought they could repay the loan because we knew you would increase the universal service. I go, why would we do that? But the point is, it's kind of the same pool of money, but you're creating these false incentives. And RUS, I haven't done the math on it, but I just thought it was a thought experiment. What if they were to say, we will forgive every loan if the companies agree never to apply for universal service again? Would that be better from the consumer's point of view? Yes, the taxpayers, who represent 100% of the population, would lose, but the consumers who are paying universal service bills, which also represent 100% of the population, may win. So I mean, I don't say that the math works out. I'm not sure. But conceptually, you have to wonder about how do we create incentives to reward the future as opposed to the past. That's the challenge.
On that note, I hope you will all join me in thanking the panel. It's been a very provocative conversation.